Welcome to the second session in our course on Rome, from founding legends to mistress of the Mediterranean. Today I want to talk about the consolidation of the Republic, and this is a rather strange class because I shall be talking about some legends, indeed let's say I shall be talking about some stories of very dubious provenance regarding the consolidation of the Republic, and I shall then proceed from that to an examination of how the Roman constitution worked. The two are connected, but I would say now that my description of the workings of the Roman Republic do not apply to any of the early centuries of the Roman Republic. This is a constitution which reached something like its last form in the century of the First Punic War. It was continually a work in progress, as is the constitution of every country, and although many Roman historians tended to read back the institutions of the present into the very early history of the Republic, we must remember that this was always a work in progress, and that what I say about the workings of the constitution do not necessarily, indeed do not probably apply to the actual practice of the early Republic. However, let's have a look at the cover slide. This is Guillaume Lethier, Brutus condemning his sons to death, 1788. I'll say more about this picture in a moment, and I'll show a rather interesting other picture which was drawn 4 years later. But let's have a recapitulation. The last king of Rome, Tarquin the Proud, Tarquin II, an Etruscan, outraged the Roman people in various ways. He outraged the nobility, the people who descended from the senators appointed by Romulus when he founded the city, by putting many of them to death. He was a tyrant. He was very much a man who went round striking off the heads of the tallest poppies. He advised his sons to do that in Gabii, and he certainly did it himself in Rome. By putting to death the leaders of the nobility, he hoped to maintain his power untarnished. He also outraged the common people by using them as slave labour on his various building projects. But everyone was frightened of him, and he was a very successful military leader, and so he might have died in his bed, but for the outrageous behaviour of his son Sextus, who raped the wife of a leading member of the nobility. Because of this rape, and because of the woman's subsequent suicide, we have that picture by Jean-Jacques David, The Oath of the Horatius, in which 3 Roman nobles undertake never to rest until they have freed Rome from the tyranny of King Tarquin and his family, and perhaps until they have freed Rome from the tyranny of any other king. The revolution proceeded very smoothly, as the story in Livy goes. Tarquin was outside Rome at the time. He was laying siege to a nearby city called Ardea. So he was outside of the city at the time of the revolution. His relatives were expelled, the gates were shut, and the Republic was declared. Let me, however, look at the man who is traditionally credited with leading the revolution against King Tarquin. Oh, but before I continue, there is a famous painting by Sandro Botticelli, The Story of Lucretia, around 1500. You can see that until perhaps the middle of the 16th century, the custom was to paint the Greeks and Romans in contemporary dress. It's a very nice painting. Those of us who are from the north always admire Italian art, which shows the clear blue sky and the very clear sunlight of the Mediterranean, and this painting shows both an abundance The rest of the painting, well, it may not bear much relation to the story in Livy, and the story in Livy may not bear much resemblance to the truth, but it's a fine painting and a fine story. But let me come to Brutus. There is a supposed bust of Brutus. Its provenance is doubtful, but it is said to be a bust of Lucius Junius Brutus, who died in 509 BC. He was a nephew of the second King Tarquin, of Tarquin the Proud. As Brutus grew up and he saw more and more of his menfolk led off to execution by the tyrant who held power in Rome, he realized that the only way to keep himself safe was to pretend to be profoundly stupid. Indeed, he was very good at playing a complete fool, and because he amused his uncle, he didn't suffer in the general massacre of the Tarquin family. However, there is an early indicator of his great political wisdom in a story about the miraculous snake. One day, the story goes, and Livy often begins his stories with "as they say" or "as the story goes," because even he doesn't necessarily believe his sources. But one day, the story goes, as Tarquin was walking through his palace in Rome, he saw a snake, a large and rather dangerous snake, crawling out of the stonework of a column. It was a miraculous vision. Tarquin was very alarmed by this, and he consulted his various religious advisors. They told him they couldn't understand what it signified, and they advised him to send a mission to the oracle at Delphi to consult the priestess of Apollo as to the meaning of the miracle and what might be done to avert any unpleasant consequences. So Tarquin got together a delegation. He decided to send his 2 sons, and because he needed 3, he added his nephew Brutus, saying, "Go on, my boy, you can see the world." Together, the 3 young men travelled all the way from Rome to Delphi. They approached the temple of Apollo. They went in and they consulted the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, as to the meaning of this miraculous vision in Rome. They were given an answer, and the answer is not tremendously important. However, the 2 sons of Tarquin, since they were there, and since they were at the most important oracle in the Greek world, decided that they might as well ask another question. So the second question they asked was, who will be the next ruler of Rome? The priestess apparently replied, the next ruler of Rome will be the first who, on returning to Rome, shall kiss his mother. So, with that information, and it was regarded as authoritative information, the 3 men set out on the long journey back to Rome. As soon as they arrived within the walls of Rome, the 2 young men, the 2 sons of Tarquin, immediately set off looking for their mother, competing as to who would first greet her and kiss her. But as he entered into the city, Brutus pretended to fall and to kiss the ground. He kissed the ground because he correctly understood the advice by the priestess that the mother of all is the earth, and so by kissing the earth, he would kiss the mother of all and therefore kiss his mother. The oracle at Delphi was known for giving ambiguous answers, which the simple-minded would take at face value and would often lead them to disaster. There is another story about the oracle at Delphi. King Croesus of Lydia was worried about the growth of the Persian Empire on his borders, so he sent a quick message to the oracle at Delphi asking, should I attack the Persians? The message he got back was, if you cross the river Halys, you'll destroy a great empire. So he immediately got his army together, marched across the Halys, and a few weeks later he was a prisoner in his own capital, ready to be burned to death. The great empire he had destroyed was his own, but that's another story. So there is an early indicator of the great political wisdom of Brutus. I must add that there is some doubt as to whether Lucius Junius Brutus actually existed. However, he was said to be the ancestor of Marcus Junius Brutus, who led the assassination plot against Julius Caesar, and it seems that Brutus was drawn into the plot by noticing placards stuck up all over Rome saying, "Where is the next Brutus?" The opposition to Caesar wanted him in the plot because it would be a second founding of the Roman Republic. So although there is no good reason to believe that Lucius Junius Brutus existed, we do know for sure that Marcus Junius Brutus believed in the existence of his illustrious ancestor, and this belief led to a completely certain historical event of great significance. Although Tarquin was outside Rome at the time of the revolution, he didn't immediately give up. He didn't accept the outcome of the revolution. At first, he did appear to accept that there had been a revolution and that he would not be allowed back into Rome. So he sent messengers to the Senate asking for the return of his personal property, saying, "Well, if you don't want me as king, I suppose I'll have to go away, but please can I have all my personal things?" The real purpose of the delegation, however, was to stir up a conspiracy among some of the younger Roman nobles for a restoration of the monarchy. This plot was discovered. It was revealed by a slave who was rewarded by a gift of his freedom and of Roman citizenship because of his patriotic informing. And the leaders of this conspiracy were all arrested and they were put on trial. Remember that Brutus had led the revolution. Brutus was one of the first two consuls appointed to take the place of the king. The consul was called on, or Brutus, as the senior consul, was called upon to judge the conspirators. However, two of the conspirators were his own sons, believe it or not. And the question was, what should he do about this? His duty as a senior magistrate of the new republic is to see that justice is done, yet his sons are involved in this treason conspiracy to restore the monarchy. What is he to do? Is he to find his own sons guilty, or is he to follow the promptings of his heart? The story is that Brutus sat in the seat of judgment with a look of absolute firmness, and he condemned his own sons to death for high treason against the Republic. They were condemned to be scourged and then to have their heads cut off. And there is the cover image again. Guillaume Letier, Brutus condemning his sons to death. First exhibited in Paris in 1788, where, like David's Oath of the Horatius 3 years earlier, it caused a sensation. And I said I would show you another picture. There it is, from 4 years later, the 21st of January 1793, the execution of Louis XVI, allegedly for treason. I said that although the French Revolution began, in the minds of the revolutionaries at least, as a rerun of the English Glorious Revolution of 1688, it very quickly turned into a rerun of the Roman Revolution of the late 6th century BC, and the execution of the king was very much a Roman-style event. Coming back, however, to the Roman Revolution, although we can't necessarily trust the details that were given of this revolution, there was a transition in the late 6th century, maybe the early 5th century BC. There was a transition from a monarchy to a republic. And there is a throwaway comment by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian of Rome, who records that there were similar revolutions in the nearby cities of Antium, Aricia, and Tusculum. These also were Latin-speaking cities, and so the Roman Revolution, or the details of the Roman Revolution as we have them, can be reconstructed into an account of the collapse of Etruscan power in central Italy. It does seem that the Romans did not elect an Etruscan to be their king, to be the first Tarquin. It seems that Rome, along with various other Latin cities in central Italy, was conquered in the early 6th century by the Etruscans, and that the Latin-speaking cities formed part of the wider Etruscan dominion over northern and central Italy. It could be seen that the republican revolutions of the late 6th century are an echo of a collapse of Etruscan power in central Italy. We don't know, but that is a possibility. Whatever the case, Rome ceased to be a monarchy around this time and became a republic, but that was not the end of the Revolutionary War, because although Tarquin seemed at first to accept the revolution, and although he sent a polite message to the Senate asking for the return of his personal effects, I've already said that that was a cover for getting up a conspiracy in Rome to restore him. When that conspiracy failed, Tarquin sought help from the Etruscan kingdoms to the north of Rome. He apparently went round the various cities telling the kings, if you tolerate this revolution in Rome, the example will spread and all the kings in Italy will soon find themselves out of a job. Therefore, give me an army and help me to gain back my kingdom. The Etruscans thought about this, and they agreed to provide him with a very large army. Though Tarquin was not the leader of this army, the leader was Lars Porsena, the Etruscan king of Clusium. He gathered together a very large army, traditionally of 90,000 men, though, again, we don't need to believe the exact details of this, and he marched on Rome. The city of Rome was not particularly well fortified at this point. The Romans tried to defeat the Etruscan invaders on the far bank of the river Tiber, and they failed. There is a moving graphic showing the battle. You have a small Roman army marching across the Sublician Bridge from Rome to the other side of the Tiber. They face an overwhelmingly larger Etruscan army, and they are pushed back. If the Etruscans get across this bridge, Rome itself will not be defended, and the Etruscans will be able to walk straight in, and that will be the end of the Roman Republic. Either Tarquin will be restored, or Lars Porsena will become the ruler of Rome. Whatever the case, there will be no more Roman Republic. At this point, a young man, Horatius, Publius Horatius, steps forward and he offers to hold the Sublician Bridge while behind him men work with hammers and axes to chop it down so that the Etruscans can't get across. The bridge is very solidly built. Cutting the bridge will take time, but the Etruscans are already moving towards it, and so somebody needs to hold the bridge. Horatius and 2 other Romans step forward and volunteer to give their lives for the safety of the Republic. I did look for a good graphic to show this. The best I could find is this one on the slide. It's a 19th century line drawing showing Horatius on the bridge. He's holding back a vast Etruscan army, while behind him men are desperately working with axes and hammers to smash down the bridge. In the end, I gave up on looking for a decent graphic, and I made that one using an artificial intelligence engine. It's about as likely as all the others. What you have here is a great mass of the enemy all running forward, while young Horatius, I didn't put in the 2 other young men who were standing with him because the story is broadly about Horatius. There is Horatius standing alone on the bridge, ready to give his life in defence of his fatherland. Because it was a narrow bridge, very few Etruscan soldiers could get onto the bridge at any one time. In this way, Horatius and his 2 comrades were able to hold the bridge. They were able to hold off an army of 90,000 men until the bridge was all broken down behind them, and Rome was safe. At this point, Horatius was on the far side of the bridge. There was no running back to safety, and so the story goes that he jumped in full armour into the Tiber and swam back to the waiting Romans on the Roman side. Even though the Etruscans were throwing spears and shooting arrows at him, he swam underwater and he emerged safe on the other side. It may not be the most likely story, because if you look at the graphic I've created, by sheer weight of numbers, the army will simply roll over him like a steamroller. But the story is that he stood there with his sword and shield, fighting them off for several hours while the bridge was destroyed behind him. And this is a story which, whatever its likelihood, has had an enormously inspiring effect throughout history. It inspired the Romans. Obviously, it inspired the Romans. If your country needs you to give up your life, you must step forward, not thinking of yourself, thinking only of the Republic. And if it does mean that you'll be killed, you'll be killed. But it is your duty to do whatever is necessary for the safety of your country. And it is a story which had an enormously inspiring effect in 19th century England. Does anyone know Horatius at the Bridge by Macaulay? No? Macaulay was a wildly popular historian in the early and middle 19th century. His history of England may not be entirely correct. It contains a great deal more truth than Livy put into his history of Rome. It is a most exciting history of England in the 19th century. When I was a boy, I read it through over and over again, and his poetry as well. His poetry nowadays has a bad reputation. His poetry in his own day had a bad reputation. Matthew Arnold claimed that he could never read Macaulay without getting a headache. But in Macaulay's day, various German scholars suggested that the early history of Rome contained very little truth in it. It was largely put together from various traditional ballads. Macaulay accepted this explanation and decided to reverse engineer Livy. He would take the stories in Book 2 of Livy and he would put them into verse, the kind of verse that would have the same effect in English as the original may have had in Latin. And his Lays of Ancient Rome were immensely popular in the 19th and in the very early 20th century. Macaulay unfortunately went out of fashion from about 1920 onwards, and sadly Very few people nowadays read him at all, but I do recommend his critical and historical essays. I recommend his History of England, and I do recommend his Lays of Ancient Rome. The most famous of these is the story of Horatius at the bridge, and you may say that my taste is rather primitive or even corrupt, but I do like Macaulay's poetry. It has a fine ring to it. It bounces along and is immensely memorable. When I was a boy, I memorized the whole of Horatius at the Bridge. And generation after generation in the 19th century of young Englishmen also memorized Horatius at the Bridge. And when the great challenge came in 1914, millions of young men stepped up, willing to become another Horatius. I like to think that Macaulay himself wouldn't have approved of the First World War, but it's rather hard to say. But there you have a story about the mythical foundings of the Roman Republic, which has had a continuing effect ever since. But although the bridge was cut and the Etruscans couldn't get across the Tiber, they had built a great camp on the far side of the Tiber, 90,000 of them. Sooner or later they will get across, and sooner or later, when they do get across, Rome will fall to the Etruscans. So what can be done to make the Etruscans go away? One answer is what we would call political terrorism. The leader of the Etruscan host is Lars Porsena, the king of Clusium. Supposing he was to be murdered, then surely the Etruscan army would fall to pieces, its various contingents would drift off, and Rome would be saved. But who is going to swim across the Tiber and assassinate the leader of a vast army in the middle of that vast army? And the volunteer is a young Roman called Gaius Mucius. He volunteers at the risk, indeed not at a risk, with the prospect of certain death, to swim across the Tiber one night and to stab Porsena to death in the middle of his camp. And that is what Mucius tries to do. He swims across the Tiber, he gets himself into the Etruscan camp, which is lit by torches. He then realizes that he has no idea what Porsena looks like. But never mind, he looks around the camp, and eventually he sees a man in a purple robe sitting at a table handing out money to the various soldiers. He thinks, that's surely Porsena. So he takes out his knife, lunges forward, and stabs the man to death. Unfortunately for him, unfortunately for the victim as well, it isn't Lars Porsena who's been killed, it is the secretary of the king. The secretary is wearing the king's cast-off clothes, and he's paying the salaries of the soldiers. So Mucius stabs him to death, he's immediately taken prisoner, and taken before the real Porsena. Porsena is very angry. He's also rather frightened, because assassination is a rather frightening thing. He explains to Mucius that there will be a very unpleasant punishment, something deeply unpleasant involving slow roasting over a fire. Mucius laughs at this, and he says to the king, "I am a Roman citizen. My name is Gaius Mucius. I came here as an enemy to kill my enemy, and I am as ready to die as I am to kill. We Romans act bravely, and when misfortune strikes, we suffer bravely. Watch me and learn how insignificant the body is to those who dedicate themselves to a greater cause." Having said those words, he thrusts his right hand into a lighted brazier, and while smiling calmly at the king, he holds his right hand there until it is consumed to ashes. Porsena is surprised, Porsena is terrified. At last, he tells the young man, You have done far worse to yourself than I had in mind to do to you. Go back to Rome. I have no further interest in this war." Porsena is so impressed by the bravery of Mucius and the promise that there is an entire army of young men who are ready to do exactly the same, that he realizes that this war is a lost cause. There's no point in prosecuting it. He breaks up his camp, he leads his army out of Roman territory, and the Republic is safe. I read this story when I was 8, and I found it rather unpleasant then. If I burn my hand on a candle, I dance around complaining how unfortunate I am. Apparently, it was very unlikely that anybody with the name of Mucius was in Rome at the time, but again, who cares about the truth when you have a good story? And again, it's a story which has had a certain influence throughout the past 2,500 years. There was, yes, here's 2 examples. The German philosopher Nietzsche, when he was a student, was arguing with his friends about whether this story was possible, and Nietzsche insisted that it was entirely possible, and he put his own right hand over a candle and would have held it there, except his friends dragged his hand away. There is also the story of Lawrence of Arabia, one of whose favourite tricks was to hold a lighted match under his fingers. If you saw the film with Peter O'Toole, he says, "It does hurt, but the trick is to pretend it doesn't hurt." An echo of the story of Gaius Mucius. Again, I looked for a decent graphic to show this story, but I couldn't find any. They were all rather overblown 17th and 18th century paintings, so I put my artificial intelligence machine to work, and it spat that out at me after considerable prompting, which is rather a good graphic. You can see Lars Porsena looking rather grim and unpleasant, surrounded by his court, and this is a military camp, so nobody is very clean, nobody is wearing pretty clothes, and there is Mucius. It's not very likely he was wearing armour. He swam across the Tiber. He probably wasn't wearing much at all, but it was the best picture I generated, and so I've gone with it. So there is the story of Gaius Mucius. Very important, because his courage all by itself persuaded Porsena to break his camp up and withdraw from Rome. There is, however, an alternative story which has an echo in Livy, that Porsena did take Rome and he held it for about a year. He didn't restore Tarquin, he decided to hold it for himself. However, he then faced problems in the north of Italy and he had to withdraw from Rome, and he never came back. And the echo of this story is the story of Cloelia. Oh, there is a quote, there is the relevant extract from Livy. I'll send you these slides and you can read that for yourselves. The story of Cloelia, and you can see why for early Roman history I've tended to avoid historical paintings. This is Rubens' Cloelia crossing the Tiber. It's very difficult to understand exactly what Livy is saying, because the traditional story in Livy is that Lars Porsena was so impressed or so frightened by the bravery of Gaius Mucius that he broke up his camp and withdrew. But Livy suddenly switches to another story in which the Romans have given hostages to Porsena. Now, since the Romans have won, why should they give hostages? But, well, that's something that I leave you to reconcile, if indeed it can be reconciled. But the Romans have given hostages to Porsena, and among these you have a large number of girls and young women. One of these young women, called Cloelia, decided to break free. So she gathered together a large number of other young women. She tricked herself past the Etruscan guards and jumped into the Tiber and swam across. evading the spears and arrows fired after her. When this breakout was reported to Porsena, he was very angry, and he told the Romans through his ambassadors that this was a fundamental breach of the treaty of peace that he had made with them, and unless they returned the girl Cloelia, he would consider the peace treaty as void. So Cloelia decided to return, but Porsena was again so impressed by the courage and initiative of Cloelia that as soon as she was returned to him, he freed her and said that she could take as many of the other hostages as she liked. So Cloelia gathered together all the girls of marriageable age and led them back to Rome. In honour of her brave action, an equestrian statue was set up at the top of the Sacred Way in Rome, an equestrian statue of Cloelia. So, for whatever reason, and it may be for these reasons, but for whatever reason, Rome has been saved. The Roman Revolution has been saved, and the Republic is now able to establish itself. What I want to do now is to give an overview of the Roman Republic's constitution. We need to understand this because if you don't have any understanding of how the Roman constitution worked or was supposed to work, it's often difficult to explain. It's often rather difficult to understand many of the other facts in later Roman history, or in Middle Roman history, because that's what we're doing in this course. Here is a diagrammatic representation of the Roman constitution. This is not the constitution as it emerged immediately after the revolution. It is something that emerged during the course of 3 or perhaps even 4 centuries. As I said earlier, a constitution is always a work in progress, even if, as the Americans have done, even if you decide to write out a constitution at the beginning of your history, the real constitution, the way in which power is exercised, will change from one generation to another. Some offices rising to great prominence, some to supremacy, others falling into abeyance. For example, in the American Constitution, the president is not really supposed to do very much, and the president is chosen by a very indirect method of election involving an electoral college. The actual American Constitution gives almost supreme power to the president, and the electoral college is little more nowadays than a rubber stamp. But the Americans have their written constitution, and they still claim that this is how the country is governed. Some of them claim that's how the country should be governed, accepting that it isn't governed in that way. But this is a diagrammatic representation of the Roman constitution. It is not a democracy. At no time in its history was Rome a democracy in the way that Athens or Locris was a democracy. The people did not rule. The people were sovereign in a vague sort of sense, but the people did not rule. Most effective power was held in the hands of the elected magistrates. These were elected by the people, but they were generally elected from within the same group of nobles, the same group of noble families, and in the hands of the Senate. The people were called to decide on certain occasions. Generally, the people decided as they were advised by their betters. So you have 4 power centres in the Roman constitution. You have the magistrates, the consuls, the praetors, the quaestors, etc. They were elected every year. They held office for only 1 year. I believe the censors held power for 18 months, but that was rather unusual. Generally speaking, the senior officers of the Roman Republic were elected for 1 year at a time, and it was fairly unusual for anyone to be re-elected to office or re-elected year after year. These people held all executive power in the Republic. They supervised justice, they led the armies, they oversaw the various public works within the city, they saw to things like the grain supply and the water supply. They were advised by the Senate, and at the end of their term in office, they would be automatically enrolled among the senators. The senators were the descendants of the nobles appointed by Romulus, as expanded by the various other kings. However, you did not inherit your role in the Senate. You became a senator after having discharged your duties as one of the elected magistrates. The number of senators was fixed at 100 by Romulus. It was expanded, I believe, to 300 by King Servius Tullius, and it remained around 300 until about the 1st century BC, when it had risen to about 600. Julius Caesar oversaw a mass creation of senators, which took the number well past 1,000. Augustus, when he became emperor, then purged the Senate, reducing its numbers to about 600. Its numbers then tended to drift downwards in the 1st century AD, before expanding in the 2nd century with a renewed mass creation of senators from the eastern provinces of the empire. But during the Republican period, the Senate was not fixed at 300, it tended to average about 300, and I would emphasise that, unlike with the British House of Lords, you do not become a senator by virtue of your father's position there. You become a senator because you have served as a consul, a praetor, a quaestor, or whatever. However, I would say that the people who tended to be elected as consuls, praetors, etc., were generally the sons of senators, so it was pretty much a self-selecting body. Formal sovereignty within the Roman Republic was possessed by the assembly of the Roman people. I'll say more about these bodies in a minute. I won't say too much about the various assemblies. It is rather complex. But it was the people meeting together on the Campus Martius who would decide things like the passing of laws, declarations of war, treaties of peace, things of that nature. Only the Roman assembly had the power to make laws. The Senate had no law-making authority. However, because the Senate was filled by men of such experience and wealth and family position, and because the Senate was generally so respected, the Senate couldn't make laws of its own motion, but the Senate could suggest laws to the Assembly which were generally accepted. So the people had the right to make laws, the people were formally sovereign, but in most circumstances they followed the lead given them by the Senate. Rather later in Roman history, the people found that these arrangements were not entirely to their advantage, because political power was almost entirely monopolized by the upper classes, and so they obtained the 4th branch of the Roman government, which was the tribunes. 10, it was a varying number, but 10 is a fair average. 10 tribunes elected every year. You had to be a plebeian to be a tribune. You were not allowed to be a member of the upper classes. If you were a member of the upper classes, you were invalid to put yourself forward as a tribune. A tribune was elected by the people from the people, and every one of those tribunes had an unconditional right of veto. A tribune could veto any act of the magistrates, of the Senate, or indeed of the assembly of the Roman people itself. And so a tribune could commute a sentence of death. A tribune could stand up after a trial when sentence had been passed and say, "In my view, it is not in the interests of the Roman people that this sentence should be carried out. I veto it." Or a tribune could stand up and veto a decision of the Senate, or he could veto a law passed by the assembly. Tribunes were sacrosanct. You couldn't touch them during their term of office. And although with the establishment of the empire, the tribuneship lapsed, part of the bundle of powers accumulated by Augustus and passed on to the other emperors was the power of a tribune. It was by virtue of holding the tribunician power that the emperor was able to sit as a final court of appeal in all trials concerning Roman citizens. When St. Paul went off to Rome, he was to be judged by Caesar because Caesar, holding the power of a tribune, had the ultimate say in whether a Roman citizen could be punished. Do I need to say more than that? Not really. I think I've covered most of the material in that slide. The takeaway point is that Rome was not and never was a democracy, and Rome was never meant to be a democracy. But at the same time, Rome was not a monarchy. Although the consuls stepped into the position of the Roman kings, there were two of them, and they held power for just 1 year, which made it very difficult for them to behave as kings. And so the Roman constitution contained elements of monarchy in the great power of the consuls. It also contained elements of oligarchy, elements of nobility, so far as the Senate was entirely composed of members of the upper classes, and the magistrates, the elected magistrates, were almost universally chosen from the upper classes. But at the same time, there was a certain democratic element in the assembly of the people, the assemblies of the people, and in the office of tribune. Rome had a balanced constitution in which the monarchical, the aristocratic, and the democratic elements were present and were able to balance each other. That was the theory of the Roman Republic, and that is how it largely worked for much of its history. But I would emphasize yet again that this is not a constitution which was discussed and agreed immediately in 509 BC when the monarchy was overthrown and the republic was established. The Roman constitution, as described by the Greek historian Polybius and as analysed by philosophers and politicians and historians during the past 2,000 plus years, was a work in progress which was not really complete until deep into its decline. However, let us move on and look at the various positions in the Roman Republic. The consuls, and there's not a perfect representation of a consul, but it's the best I could manage at the time. The consuls, they were the chief magistrates, they were the military commanders, they led the Roman armies to war, and since the Republic was almost continually at war one way or another, the consuls were mostly absent from Rome. But when a consul was in Rome, he would go about in a toga with a purple stripe on to symbolize his kingly power, and he would be surrounded by bodyguards, all of them carrying bundles of rods and axes to show his supreme power over Roman citizens. Consuls had almost unlimited power. They could do almost anything they liked. They couldn't make laws, but they could execute the laws in very largely the manner of their choosing. They could behave very despotically. But remember, They were limited by two facts. The first is that a consul is elected for 1 year. And although the convention broke down at the end of the 2nd century that a consul should not seek re-election, and certainly shouldn't seek re-election year after year, as Gaius Marius did around 100 BC, a consul held his power for 1 year only. There were also 2 consuls. Usually they made an amicable division of their functions. One might lead the armies, the other might stay at home and do things in the city, or they might lead separate armies. But there were 2 of these consuls, and each one could veto the acts of the other if they so chose. Quite often, certainly in later Roman history, you did have a breakdown of this dual consulship. Very often you'd have 2 consuls elected, but only one of them held effective power. The other one was simply on the ticket as somebody's colleague, and he would do some of the heavy lifting, he would do some of the paperwork, but all of the important decisions were made by the main consul. That was very much the case when Gaius Marius was elected and re-elected consul at the end of the 2nd century BC. It was very much the position when Julius Caesar was elected consul. He was the ruler of Rome. His colleague was simply there to make up the numbers. But the theory was that the 2 consuls had equal power and they each could check the actions of the other. So the consuls are the chief magistrates. Under them you have the praetors. These operated mostly as judges. Occasionally they led armies and they were junior to consuls, but their main job was to look after the judicial system in Rome. None of these offices was actually abolished by Augustus and his successors. They were simply merged into the imperial administration, and the Praetorian prefect, a praetor, became the empire's senior judicial officer. The Praetorian prefect operated rather like the Lord Chancellor in England. He was appointed by the emperor, and he was the chairman of the Supreme Court in the empire. You then have the quaestors, fairly junior officers. They managed the treasury and military finances. Oh, and the aediles, infrastructure maintenance, market oversight, public amusements. One of their jobs was to provide the gladiatorial games for the Roman people. There was a budget, there was a state budget set aside for these amusements, but quite often the officers concerned would supplement these budgets from their own pockets. Later in the Republic, the upper classes became gigantically rich, and they were able to lay on vast and lavish gladiatorial games going on for many days at a time, far in excess of the amount budgeted by the state. They were simply paid for by the men themselves. You then have the tribunes, the protectors of the people, who could veto all government decisions. So those are the elected officers. I've left off any discussion of the dictator because that is a position that was within the constitution, but which was only brought into use in moments of great crisis. When everything else failed and when Rome was in serious danger, the Senate could choose a dictator, somebody who would hold absolute and unaccountable power over every Roman citizen for a maximum of 6 months. A position which was not filled up very often in the Republican period. Towards the end, it was refashioned by Julius Caesar. He was appointed dictator for life before his assassination. It was a position taken over by Augustus, but he decided that it was slightly unusual to have a dictator for life, so he resigned it and became something else, but that takes us outside our period. The consuls. Although the Republic collapsed at the end of the 1st century, I've said that none of these offices was actually abolished by the emperors. They were merged into the imperial administration, and consuls continued to be appointed until deep into the 6th century AD. There is an ivory representation of the Emperor Anastasius, who ruled in Constantinople. He served a consulship in 517 AD, and there is a representation of him in the contemporary clothing of a consul. The consulship lapsed during the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. No more were appointed, but the name of consul was never forgotten, and there on the right you have a picture of the 3 consuls, the Council of State, appointed in 1796, when the French Revolution had run out of steam and the various democratic experiments were replaced by various forms of disguised military dictatorship. 3 consuls appointed in 1796, I think, and the first consul was Napoleon Bonaparte. There he is, standing in front of the other 2 consuls, being greeted with Roman salutes by the other officers of state. It was not a successful constitutional experiment, and eventually Napoleon decided that the title of first consul was not quite so attractive as the title of emperor, but he did spend some time as a consul. It's a name which has stuck around ever since. The Senate. Not elected, not like in America. It was not appointed necessarily, though during the imperial period the emperor appointed consuls by virtue of his office as censor. Senators were co-opted. If you served your time as a consul or as a praetor or as a quaestor, you would be enrolled among the senators. So it is not an hereditary position like an English peerage. It is a position filled up by co-option. The senators would invite former magistrates to sit among themselves. But because the elected officers of state tended to be from the same group of noble families, in effect, membership of the Senate was hereditary. Your father was a senator, your grandfather was a senator, you would become a senator having served an office, and your son after you presumably would become a senator. There was a property qualification, and if your property fell below the threshold, you would be expelled. It was also possible for the censor, another elected official of the Republic, to expel senators on the grounds of misbehaviour. The Senate, I've already said, had no law-making power, but its prestige was so great that quite often the Senate could give an opinion which was treated as equivalent to a law, but otherwise the Senate would suggest laws to the popular assembly, and these would generally be enacted. When Augustus died in 14 AD and Tiberius became the emperor, he abolished the assemblies of the people. He said they were useless and an occasion for disorder, and from that time onwards the Senate did, formally at least, become a sovereign law-making assembly, though even then it mostly ratified laws proposed to it by the emperor. But in the Republican period, the Senate was an advisory council. The senators were there all the time. The consuls, the praetors, etc. were elected for a year at a time. The Senate contained a great deal of collective wisdom, and so if one of the elected magistrates had any sense, he would work very closely with the Senate, and if the Senate suggested that something should be done, he would usually take that advice. The actual powers of the Senate, its formal legal powers, were largely confined to the fact that the Senate was in charge of the treasury. The popular assembly could make laws, the consuls could execute laws, but if the Senate disagreed, the Senate could refuse to grant the necessary funds for the law to be carried into effect, or could withhold the necessary funds for executing the laws. In that sense, the senators did have a great deal of fall power. They held the purse strings. But apart from that, they were an advisory council with enormous prestige. They wore a special toga with a purple border. They had special seating set aside for them at all public events. And they had immense social and cultural prestige. And later on in the history of the Republic, they also tended to be very rich. Though in the early Republic, they were not tremendously rich, they were just somewhat richer than the plebeians. They had more land, but not very much more land. So that is the Senate. A question about eligibility to sit in the Senate. You could not become a senator unless you had served as one of the elected magistrates.
Right.
If you did serve as an elected magistrate, you were automatically co-opted at the end of your term of office into the Senate. You would then sit as a senator for life unless you were removed for misconduct or unless it turned out that you didn't possess the minimum property qualification. The senators tended to be people of great knowledge of the law and of politics because they had been through what's called the cursus honorum. They had held all of the important offices in the Roman Republic. So, yes, the senators were usually men of considerable experience. They had led armies, they had sat as judges, they had executed the laws in various ways, they had overseen the water supply. They understood these matters, and sitting as a body, if they were of the determined opinion that something should be done, it generally was done, and if they suggested a new law to the people, it would generally be accepted. Not always. There were political disputes, there were continual political disputes between the popular assemblies and the Senate, but when it came to lawmaking, the assemblies tended to follow the lead given by the Senate. Again, I had trouble finding a decent graphic representation of a meeting of the Senate, so I'm afraid I had to go back to my usual artificial intelligence engine and to generate some. These are rather fanciful, but looking at them, I think they do give a pretty fair representation of a meeting of the Senate. You can see that there are various secretaries making notes, handling the necessary paperwork, able to read out former decisions of the Senate, and you have the senators speaking and politely arguing with each other. Many of the most important political events of the Republic happened in the Senate House. Whether the Senate House looked like that, or those representations, is another matter. There is a Senate House in Rome. It survived because it was converted into a church in the 6th century AD, but that is rather a late version of the Senate House. It was built, I think, by Diocletian, but I can't remember. The Senate House burned down several times in its history and was rebuilt and embellished in various ways, but that is broadly the idea of how the Senate probably looked. The assemblies, those were rather complex. There was not a single assembly. It's not like Athens, where every male citizen over the age of 18 would turn up in the marketplace several times a month. Anyone could propose laws, anyone could speak, everyone could vote. The Roman assemblies were differently structured. You had many of these assemblies, the Comitia Centuriata, the Concilium Plebis, Those were the most important, but they were not the only ones. The Comitia Centuriata, that was the principal assembly, and this was the assembly where the people elected the consuls, the praetors, and the other magistrates. However, it was organized into different groups. People did not vote in the Comitia Centuriata as individuals. They voted as voting blocks. The richer plebeians were formed into rather a small block, but they had the same power as the poorer citizens organized into a much larger block. Each block had equal voting rights, and it gave a certain electoral preponderance to the wealthier classes when it came to the election of senior officers. I may not have explained that very closely. Let's imagine this. One voting block has 100 members, another voting block has 5,000 members. These blocks argue within themselves over to whom they'll give their vote for the election of a new consul. Once they've decided, their representatives then stand forward and cast their votes. And the vote of the 100 people is worth the same as the vote of the 5,000 people. Have I explained that clearly? It is not the case that every Roman citizen could turn up and vote as an individual for a consul. Roman citizens were organized into voting groups, and these voting groups were of different sizes, but each voting group had an equal vote in the election of a consul or of other magistrates. You then have the Concilium Plebis, the council of the people. This elected the tribunes. It also passed laws. That was where the laws were submitted for ratification by the Senate. And this was a rather more democratic body. But in the earlier period, the Concilium Plebis tended to follow the advice of the Senate. In the later period, it was often bribed by the wealthy into voting one way or another. I keep on saying that at no time in its history was Rome any kind of democracy, but it did have certain democratic elements in which the voice of the people had a formal say in the government of the Republic. Again, I had trouble finding representations of the popular assemblies, but ChatGPT came to my assistance in its usual way. And these are two representations of these meetings. Whether they looked exactly like that is another matter, but it does give you a pretty good idea that these were highly formal proceedings. The people did not gather round in a great mass, arguing and voting and generally doing whatever they thought suitable. The whole thing was very closely supervised by the various secretariats, and only those laws were passed which were generally acceptable to the secretariat. The religion. We live in a world where it's taken as standard that there should be some kind of division between church and state, some kind of separation of church and state. And although we have an established church in England, it does not perform the same role that it did even in the 19th century. We're used to the idea of living in a broadly secular state where you can believe what you like, but your particular religion has no formal say in the government of the country. This was not the case in Rome. Although there were personal religions, although many people believed in religions which had not been established by the state, and people broadly had the right to believe or not to believe as they pleased, there was an established religion in the Roman Republic, and it was regarded as necessary for the safety of the state that certain religious observances should be properly performed. In the monarchical period of Roman history, the chief priest of the nation was, of course, the king. The king was the head of government. He was also the head of the religion. After the revolution, there were certain functions regarded as so holy that they could only be discharged by a king, and so the office of the Rex Sacrorum emerged. This was someone who held the formal title of king but had no political power. There was something similar in the Athenian democracy, but the Rex Sacrorum tended to fade out as the Republic moved on through its history and was replaced by a council of priests, and the chief priest was known as the Pontifex Maximus, which of course is one of the titles held by the Pope. When Constantine, in the early 4th century, established Christianity within the Roman Empire, he felt it rather embarrassing to be the Pontifex Maximus, to be the head of the old pagan religion, so he appointed the Pope, the Patriarch of Rome, as the Pontifex Maximus, a title which has been held ever since by the popes. So there is a republican office which still has a holder. Indeed, the title of Pontifex Maximus has been held in unbroken succession from the early days of the Republic to the present. The present Pope is the Pontifex Maximus, and there has been no time in the last 2,500 years when there has not been a Pontifex Maximus. The Pontifex Maximus oversaw the performance of the necessary religious rites in the Republic. He also supervised the various junior priestly bodies. The most important of these were the Vestal Virgins. This was a group of young women, noble young women, who gave up 30 years of their lives to looking after the sacred fire and performing rituals for the well-being of Rome. The Pontifex Maximus also oversaw the various attempts at divination, trying to predict the future by looking at the entrails of sacrificed animals, or counting birds and measuring their flight, or looking after sacrifices to various other gods. And so there was no separation of religion and state under the Roman Republic. There was an official state religion. Although nobody was required to believe in it, everybody was required to go through certain motions. Indeed, thinking ahead, one of the reasons why the Roman government didn't like the Christians was because the Christians refused to involve themselves in any of the pagan rituals which were part of the everyday life of the Roman people. If you refused to take any part in those rituals, you were putting yourself outside the Roman people. Nobody was required to believe that the gods existed. Nobody was required to believe that the sacrifices had any spiritual significance, but it was very important that those sacrifices and those rituals should be performed. The Christians refused, and as such, they were, in the formal sense, traitors. There are two rather fanciful representations generated yesterday of the rituals of the established faith in Rome, mostly the sacrifice of animals. Although these are rather bloodthirsty images, and although you can say, oh, how disgusting, how could you sacrifice poor little animals, or even poor big animals, thinking that the gods will like their blood? What I might say is that the animals were then cut up, cooked and eaten. Most people didn't eat meat every day. Most of the meat sold in the markets in ancient cities was the meat of sacrificial victims. You could regard the pagan rituals as effectively slaughterhouses run by the upper classes. Instead of having a slaughterhouse where people are working on minimum wage to cut the throats of the sheep or stun the pigs with bolt guns, instead you have the most senior people in the community having to butcher the meat and cut it up themselves. You can take a rather dark view of the pagan religions, but it was one way of keeping the meat markets well provided. But the sacrifices were important. They had to be performed. They had to be performed for the safety of the Republic. And as I said, there was no requirement that the priests should believe it, but there was a requirement that they should go through the motions of believing. So that is a brief overview of the Roman constitution. And it is necessary to understand how this constitution evolved, and certainly some understanding of how the constitution worked, because we will come on to look at endless political disputes over the status of the plebeians and their diminishing exclusion from public affairs. And in order to understand the details of these disputes, in order to understand the generality of the disputes, you need to understand that the Roman Republic had a balanced constitution in which democratic, monarchical, and aristocratic elements were blended, but in which those three elements were continually in conflict with each other. Conflicts which might spill out into the external events of the Republic. But I see I've been talking. I've come to the end. I've finished the slides. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I will send these slides. Indeed, I'll send them in the next few minutes. But any questions or comments?